It was early morning on June 24th, 1314. The sun was just starting to rise over the Scottish hills, slowly lighting up the fields near the Bannockburn stream. The air felt heavy, full of the worry of many thousands of men who knew that this day would forever change the future of two countries. On one side, the very strong English army, led by the young King Edward II, son of the scary Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots. On the other, a smaller but very brave Scottish army commanded by Robert the Bruce, a man who had been made King of Scotland 8 years before in a surprising and argued-about way. But before we talk about this big day, before we show you the secret weapon that changed the battle and made the most powerful fighting force of the time look weak, we need to know how they got here. We need to go back in time and understand the old and deep reasons for this fight that soaked the land between England and Scotland with blood for many years. This is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of a group of people fighting for their right to exist, of new and clever military plans, and of how being smart can beat being strong. If you're liking this story, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment about the time you watched this video. Now let's begin our trip. To understand Bannockburn, we must first understand Scotland in the 1200s. It was a land of tall mountains, deep valleys, and a proud people who loved their freedom more than anything else. For a long time, Scotland had kept its independence with its own kings, its own rules, and its own special way of life. But this independence was always looked at with suspicion and a wish to take over by the English kings to the south. King Alexander III of Scotland ruled well and brought good times to the kingdom. Under his time as king, Scotland had a kind of golden age, but bad luck is cruel and hard to guess. On a stormy night in March of 1286, Alexander was riding along the coast when his horse tripped in the dark. The king fell off a high rock and died right away. With his death, a problem over who would be king started that would open the door for England to get involved. Alexander's only direct family left was his granddaughter Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, because she lived at the Norwegian court. She was only a 3-year-old child. The Scottish noblemen set up a group of leaders to rule until Margaret could take the throne. Edward I of England, always cunning and looking for a chance, saw his opportunity. He suggested a marriage between the young Margaret and his son Edward of Caernarvon. It was a smart plan that could join the two crowns without fighting. But bad luck stepped in again. In 1290, when Margaret was finally sailing to Scotland, she got sick during the sea journey. The young queen died in the Orkney Islands, never having stepped foot in her kingdom. With her death, the direct royal family line was gone. Many people claimed they should be king, each saying they had a right because of complicated family trees. The two main people were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, the grandfather of the future hero of Bannockburn. The Scottish nobleman, afraid of a civil war, made what many would later think was a terrible mistake. They asked Edward to decide who should be king first. Edward happily said yes, but on one condition: all candidates must say he was the higher boss of Scotland. It was a carefully set trap. Edward chose John Balliol as king, but made it clear that Balliol would rule only as his servant. John Balliol was crowned King of Scotland in 1292, but he was a king in name only. Edward started treating Scotland like a lesser country, always getting involved in its private business, calling Scottish noblemen to the English court, and demanding that Scottish soldiers fight in his wars in France. It was a constant shame. Balliol was made fun of as Tomb Tabard, or empty coat, suggesting he was a king without real power. Problems grew until finally in 1295 the Scottish noblemen fought back. They set up a council to rule for Balliol and made an agreement with France, England's traditional enemy. This agreement, known as the Auld Alliance, would last for hundreds of years. It was the start of the Wars of Scottish Independence. Edward the Farn was not a man to let people question his power. He had conquered Wales with quick cruelty, and now he would look toward Scotland. In 1296, he led a huge army across the border. What followed was a campaign of terrible actions. The town of Berwick which was then one of Scotland's richest, was attacked and ruined with shocking violence. Thousands of regular people were killed. The message was clear. Fighting back would be punished by being completely destroyed. The English army marched through southern Scotland with almost no one stopping them. At Dunbar, the Scottish forces finally faced the English in a big fight. It was a disaster. The English cavalry, the most feared in Europe, crushed the Scottish groups. Thousands died. The people who survived ran away in confusion. John Balliol, realizing the fight was lost, gave up his crown and was taken prisoner to England. The Stone of Destiny, the old symbol of the Scottish kings upon which kings were crowned, was taken to Westminster as a prize of war. Edward at first seemed to have completely taken over Scotland. He set up an English government, put soldiers in important castles, and demanded that Scottish noblemen swear loyalty to him. Many did, including Robert Bruce, the future hero of Bannockburn. But underneath the surface, anger was building. Scotland was not beaten, just put down for a time. It was in this moment that the figure of William Wallace appeared. Wallace was a small knight, not a great nobleman, but he had something many lords lacked, an unwavering rage against the English takeover. In 1297, Wallace led a revolt that spread quickly across southern Scotland. His biggest win came at Stirling Bridge, where he showed a brilliant understanding of battle plans and the land. The confident and proud English army tried to cross a narrow bridge over the river. Wallace waited patiently until a large part of the English forces were on the other side, but not all. Then he attacked. The English on the bridge could neither run back nor move forward. Those who had crossed were trapped and killed. The English heavy horse riders, normally impossible to beat in open fields, were useless in the wet, soft ground near the bridge. It was a crushing victory that proved the English could be beaten. Wallace was declared a guardian of Scotland, but his fame would not last long. Edward IV came back to Scotland the following year with new strength. At Falkirk, Wallace tried to do his earlier tricks again, forming his men into schiltrons, round groups of spear fighters that looked like giant steel hedgehogs. For a time, these formations held up against the English cavalry's attacks, but Edward had something that would change the game. Archers. The English archers, using the powerful Welsh longbow, rained arrows on the Scottish formations. The schiltrons, which were great for defense against horses, couldn't move without breaking their shape. The Scots were stuck, being slaughtered by thousands of arrows, while the English cavalry waited. When the formations finally fell apart, the cavalry charged and finished the killing. Wallace ran away, his good name hurt by the defeat. The next few years were dark for Scotland. Wallace fought a secret hit-and-run war until he was betrayed and caught in 1305. He was taken to London, where he was given a fake trial and then killed with extreme cruelty. He was hanged, cut open, chopped into pieces, and beheaded. His head was put on a spike on London Bridge as a warning. His body was split up and sent to be shown in different cities. Edward I wanted to destroy not only the man, but also the idea he stood for. It was at this darkest moment that Robert the Bruce made the choice that would change everything. Bruce had a claim to the Scottish throne through his grandfather, who had been one of the first people to claim it. But more importantly, he had the bravery and drive to lead Scotland to independence. In February 1306, Bruce met with John Comyn, his main competitor for the Scottish crown, at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. Exactly what happened at that meeting is still argued about by historians, but the result is clear. Comyn was stabbed to death at the Holy Altar. Killing Comyn on holy ground was a terrible, disrespectful act. Bruce was immediately thrown out of the church by the Pope, but he had passed the point of no return. There was no going back. 6 weeks later, Bruce was crowned King of Scotland at Scone. The ceremony was done quickly and simply. The real Stone of Destiny was in London. Only a few noblemen were there, but the deed was done. Robert the Bruce had said he was king. Edward's reaction was easy to guess at first. He sent armies to crush this rebellious king. Bruce faced defeat after defeat. At Methven, his small army was caught by surprise and scattered. Bruce fled to the mountains and then to the Western Islands. The story is that hiding in a cave during this very bad time, Bruce watched a spider repeatedly try to spin its web, falling down several times but always trying again. Inspired by the spider's stubbornness, Bruce decided never to give up. Bruce spent the next few years fighting a brutal secret war. He avoided big battles he couldn't win. Instead, he attacked English groups in faraway places, burned castles he couldn't hold, and disappeared into the mountains when bigger English forces showed up. It was a tactic of wearing the enemy down that tested English patience and supplies. Slowly, with great effort, Bruce took more control over northern Scotland. In 1307, Edward I, now 68 and sick, made a final try to crush Bruce. He gathered an army and marched north, but his body finally failed him. Edward died at Berg by Sands near the Scottish border, never having finished his conquest of Scotland. With his last breath, he supposedly ordered his son not to bury his body until Scotland was conquered, and that his bones be carried at the head of the English army. Luckily for history, Edward II ignored his father's scary wish. Edward II was the opposite of his father. Where Edward the Fun was an expert soldier and smart leader, Edward II was unsure and not interested in fighting. He liked being with his court friends more than planning wars. This change in leader was a gift for Bruce. In the following years, Bruce made his control over Scotland stronger, capturing castle after castle from English soldiers. Bruce came up with special ways to deal with English forts. He rarely laid siege to them directly, as this took time and things he didn't have. Instead, he used surprise and cleverness. At Perth, his men climbed the walls at night while Bruce showed the way, being among the first to walk into the icy water of the moat. At Roxburgh, the Scots pretended to be cows, crawling on all fours until they were under the walls before attacking. At Edinburgh, a small group climbed the cliff on which the castle was built, which was thought to be impossible to climb. But the best prize of Bruce's wins was Stirling Castle. This castle controlled the road between the Scottish lowlands and highlands. Whoever controlled Stirling practically controlled the center of Scotland. Bruce's brother, Edward Bruce, attacked Stirling in 1313. The castle's English commander, Sir Philip Mowbray, suggested a deal. If an English army didn't come to save the castle by St. John the Baptist's Day, June 24, 1314, he would give up the castle to the Scots. Edward Bruce accepted without asking his brother. When Robert Bruce heard about the agreement, he was very angry. He immediately understood what this meant. Edward II, even though he didn't want to fight in Scotland, couldn't ignore this direct challenge without completely losing respect. He would be forced to gather an army and march on Scotland, and that would mean a big battle, exactly the kind of fight Bruce had been avoiding for years. Edward II did indeed take the challenge. During the spring of 1314, he got together the largest army England had put together in years. Knights, armed men, and archers came from all over England and the English lands of Wales. People who study history disagree on the exact number, but careful guesses put the English army at between 15,000 and 20,000 men, including about 2,500 heavily armored cavalry. It was an amazing force. The English cavalry was thought to be among the best in Europe. These knights were professional soldiers trained from childhood in the art of fighting on horseback. They wore full chainmail and plate armor, closed helmets, and carried long spears and swords. Their horses were large, strong animals, specially raised for war. When a heavy cavalry charge hit an enemy line, it was like being hit by a wave of steel and muscle. Robert the Bruce watched the English preparations with growing worry. He had maybe 6,000 to 8,000 men, less than half of what Edward commanded. Worse still, the vast majority of Bruce's forces were light foot soldiers, Highlanders, and farmers armed with spears, axes, and knives. He had very few horse riders, maybe 500 light horsemen at most. In a normal big battle against the English war machine, The Scots would have been wiped out. But Bruce didn't plan to fight a normal battle. He had learned from Stirling Bridge and Falkirk. The land would be his friend. Clever battle plans would be his weapon. And he had something else, a secret weapon unknown to the English that would completely change the way medieval battle was fought. Bruce chose his battlefield with great care. He placed his army near Stirling in an area known as New Park, a region of partly cleared woods. In front of their spots flowed the Bannockburn, a stream that created wet and difficult ground on its banks. To their rear was Torwood Forest, giving an escape route if needed. But the most important thing about the land Bruce chose was that it was narrow. Between the woods, wet ground, and stream, there was only a relatively thin strip of solid ground, good for the movement of large groups of soldiers. This meant that the English army, even though it was much bigger, could not use its numbers to go around or surround the Scots. They would be forced to attack straight on ground chosen by Bruce. But Bruce had another surprise ready. In the days before the battle, his men dug thousands of small holes in the field in front of their positions. These pits, called pots in Old Scottish, were about a foot wide and 12 to 18 inches deep. They were then carefully hidden with branches and grass. These traps were terrible for horse riders. A running horse that stepped into one of these pits would instantly break its leg, throwing its rider and creating a mess in the attacking group. This was Bannockburn's secret weapon. Not a new shiny technology, not a highly trained special unit, but simply the smart use of a simple and old tactic. Pit traps had been used in war for hundreds of years, but never on this scale or with this good effect, combined with the tight land and the solid groups of Scottish spear fighters. These traps would turn the mighty English cavalry from an unbeatable force into a confused and easy-to-hit crowd. On June 23rd, the night before the main battle, a small fight happened that would become famous. The English army was getting close to Stirling when a group of English knights under Sir Henry de Bohun saw Robert the Bruce looking over their lines. Bruce was on a horse, but on a small palfrey, a riding horse, not a war horse. He carried only a battle axe and was wearing light armor. De Bohun, a young and ambitious knight, saw a chance for great glory. If he could kill the Scottish king in a one-on-one fight, the rebellion would end right away. He lowered his spear and galloped toward Bruce. The armies on both sides stopped to watch. Bruce held his spot until the very last moment. When de Bohun was almost on top of him, Bruce pulled his horse aside. De Bohun's spear passed without hitting anything. Bruce stood up in his saddle and brought his battle axe down with all his power, splitting de Bohun's skull through his helmet. It was a moment of pure, exciting action. The Scots cheered loudly. The English were shocked. Bruce had not only survived, but killed an English knight in single combat. The story goes that when Bruce returned to his own lines, his commanders scolded him for risking so much. Bruce simply looked at his battle axe, which now had a cracked handle from the impact, and sadly said he had broken his best weapon. This small fight set the mood for what was to come. The English tried several more quick attacks that afternoon, but were pushed back. During the night, the English army set up camp in a terrible spot. They were on low, wet ground, squeezed between the Bannockburn and another stream called Pelham Muir. It was a place where their advantage in numbers meant nothing, and their disadvantages on the land were huge. The army's experienced commanders advised Edward II to pull back, reorganize, and choose better ground. But the young king, already embarrassed by the day's events, refused to retreat. Meanwhile, in the Scottish camp, Bruce was facing his own problem. Many of his commanders, seeing the huge size of the English army, suggested retreating. After all, if Stirling fell, they could simply take it back later, as they had done with so many other castles. But at that moment, something amazing happened. An English knight named Sir Alexander Seton, who had fought on the English side but was Scottish by birth, switched sides to Bruce. Seton brought important news. He talked about the low spirits in the English camp, their bad position, and the mess and confusion in command. Most importantly, He begged Bruce to attack. Seaton argued that the English had never been easier to beat, and that if Bruce attacked at dawn, he could win. This information changed Bruce's mind. He decided to risk everything in a big battle. As dawn broke on June 24th, the Scots held church services. They confessed their sins and received forgiveness, getting their souls ready for what was to come. Then, to the English amazement, the Scottish army began to move forward, leaving their safe spots and marching toward the enemy. The Scots advanced in 4 big Schiltron groups, thick masses of spear fighters with spears 13 to 16 feet long, pointing outward in all directions. Edward II, watching this advance, misunderstood what he was seeing. When he saw the Scots kneel briefly in prayer, he asked one of his commanders if they were giving up. The commander answered that yes, they were kneeling but asking forgiveness from God, not him. The Scots were coming to fight. The English response was messy and unorganized. The cramped spot made it hard to line up forces correctly. The cavalry, the army's main weapon, was squished and unable to move freely. But the English were so sure of their cavalry's superiority that they launched charge after charge against the moving Scottish formations. The first charges were terrible for the English. Horses running fast began to fall into hidden pits. Knights, in full armor, were thrown to the ground. Other horses, seeing their friends falling, refused to go forward, rearing up and spinning. The carefully planned charge formation broke down into total chaos. Those knights who managed to reach the Scottish lines found the Schiltrons impossible to break. The long Scottish spears cut open horses and found the weak spots in the knights' armor. The Schiltrons were brilliant formations both for attacking and defending. Each Schiltron held hundreds of men, packed close together, with the first 4 rows keeping their spears pointed out. It was like a giant steel porcupine. Horse riders couldn't get through it because horses wouldn't charge against a wall of spikes. Foot soldiers fighting alone couldn't break it because any man getting close faced many spears. And most importantly, Bruce had trained his men to keep these moving groups together. The Scottish Schiltrons moved forward slowly but surely, pushing the English back. Each step forward was hard to win, but the momentum was with the Scots. The English, unable to use their horse riders well in the cramped, wet ground, began to panic. The group started to break. Men in the back, unable to see what was happening in front but hearing the cries of the hurt and dying, began to run away. The English archers, the force that had been so deadly at Falkirk, tried to step in. If they could line up and begin raining arrows on the tightly packed Scottish formations, they could break the Schiltrons, as they had done before. But Bruce had prepared a way to stop this. He held his small force of light cavalry in reserve just for this moment, as the English archers began to set up the Scottish light cavalry. Only 500 men under Marshal Keith charged straight at them. Archers equipped with long-range weapons were easy to hurt in close combat, especially against horse riders. The English archers lacked the pointed stakes that would later become standard for defending against cavalry. They broke and fled. Some managed to escape, but many were cut down. With the archers scattered, the last English hope of breaking the Scottish Schiltrons disappeared. The battle now turned into a slow, organized slaughter. The Scottish Schiltrons continued their relentless move forward. The English, squashed into an ever smaller space, began to fall in complete panic. Men stumbled over each other as they tried to run back. Heavily armored knights, without their horses, were unable to move in the wet ground and sank into the mud. Some drowned in their own helmets in only a few inches of water, the weight of their armor holding them down. Edward II, realizing the battle was lost, was literally pulled from the battlefield by his bodyguards. He fled to Stirling Castle, but surprisingly the castle's commander, Sir Philip Mowbray, refused him entry. Mowbray explained that with the battle lost, the castle would soon be attacked, and the king's presence would only make its downfall happen faster. Edward was forced to take a dangerous route around the battlefield, running for his life with a small group of guards. He finally reached Dunbar, and from there sailed back to England, shamed and defeated. For the rest of the English army, there was no such escape. The Scots chased the fleeing soldiers without stopping. The Bannockburn, which had been a small obstacle, became a death trap as thousands of panicked Englishmen tried to cross it all at once. Men drowned in the mud. Their piled bodies created temporary bridges over which others tried to flee. The waters ran red with blood. Estimates of the number killed vary, but it is clear that the English army was crushed. Hundreds of knights were killed or captured, including many of England's most important noblemen. The Earl of Gloucester, who had argued with Edward II before the battle, and then led a suicidal charge to prove his courage, was among the dead. Thousands of common English and Welsh soldiers were killed. It was one of the worst military defeats in English history. For the Scots, the victory was complete, and the rewards were huge. The battlefield was covered with valuable armor, weapons, and equipment. The Scots captured the English royal seal used to prove official papers were real. They captured the royal baggage, including treasures and documents. Most importantly, they captured many high-ranking English noblemen who would be ransomed for huge amounts of money that would help pay for Scotland for years to come. But besides the material gains, Bannockburn had a deep meaning in people's minds and feelings. It proved that the English army could be totally defeated. It showed that clever battle plans and the land could overcome superior numbers and equipment. It changed Robert the Bruce from a rebel king fighting for his right to rule into a national hero and proven leader. And it shattered the English idea of always winning over Scotland. In the years after Bannockburn, Bruce made his control stronger over Scotland and even launched attacks into northern England. The war would continue for another 14 years, but England would never again be in a position to conquer Scotland by fighting. In 1328, Edward III finally signed the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, which recognized Scottish independence and Robert the Bruce as the rightful king of Scotland. Bruce did not live long to enjoy his final victory. He died in 1329, likely of leprosy. With his dying breath, he supposedly asked that his heart be taken on a holy war to the Holy Land, something he had never been able to do in his lifetime because of his wars. His loyal friend, Sir James Douglas, tried to fulfill this wish, but died fighting the Moors in Spain. Bruce's heart was eventually returned to Scotland and buried in Melrose Abbey. The impact of Bannockburn went far beyond Scotland itself. The battle showed that heavy cavalry, for hundreds of years considered the best military force in Europe, had big weaknesses that could be used by a smart commander with disciplined foot soldiers and good use of the land. The lessons in battle planning from Bannockburn were studied by military leaders for generations. The importance of choosing the land, preparing the battlefield ahead of time, using traps and obstacles to control and confuse the enemy, and keeping groups together even under extreme pressure. All these rules became a part of the standard ideas of war. Many years later, English commanders would face similar defeats on French soil during the 100 Years' War, when French cavalry would repeatedly charge against well-prepared English positions and be killed in large numbers. But Bannockburn wasn't just important for fighting. It was a key moment in the shaping of Scottish national identity. The battle became part of the national stories, a symbol of fighting back against huge odds, of cleverness winning over pure strength, and of a people fighting for their right to decide their own future. Every generation of Scots since has grown up hearing stories of Robert the Bruce and his great win at Bannockburn. The Declaration of Arbroath, written in 1320, 6 years after Bannockburn, perfectly captured the feeling that victory had inspired. This extraordinary paper sent to the Pope by Scottish noblemen declared that they fought not for fame or money, but only for freedom. It contained the famous passage saying that as long as 100 Scots remained alive, they would never surrender to English rule. And, remarkably for its time, it declared that if Robert the Bruce stopped defending Scottish liberty, they would remove him and choose another king. It was an early statement of the idea that power belonged to the people and not in the God-given right of kings. Bannockburn's secret weapon, those simple pits dug on the battlefield, represented something bigger than just a clever military trick. It represented the idea that creativity and preparation could make the fight fair against a more powerful enemy. The Scots didn't have the money to match England in heavy cavalry or modern military equipment, but they had shovels to dig holes. They had knowledge of their own land. They had the will to fight smart rather than simply fight bravely. It's important to note that Bruce's victory at Bannockburn was not a lucky break or a sudden success. It was the end result of years of careful planning, learning from earlier losses, patiently building an effective army, and detailed preparation. Bruce had spent years studying Wallace's wins and failures. He learned when to fight and when to avoid battle. He understood that Scottish independence would not be won in one glorious battle, but through a long effort of wearing the enemy down that would test the English desire to continue. And when the moment finally arrived, when things forced him to risk everything in a big battle, Bruce left nothing to chance. He chose the battlefield carefully. He prepared the ground completely. He positioned his forces to make their advantages as big as possible and make their weaknesses as small as possible. He kept reserves to deal with specific dangers like the English longbowmen, and he led by example, inspiring his men with his personal bravery. The feelings of the battle cannot be ignored either. The Scots entered Bannockburn believing they could win. They had seen Bruce defeat English forces repeatedly in smaller skirmishes over the years. They had seen his dramatic duel with de Bohun the day before. They were fighting on their own soil, defending their homes and families, and they were fighting for a king who had shown his willingness to risk everything for the Scottish cause. The English, by contrast, entered the battle too confident in their superiority, but not truly believing in the fight. Many of the English noblemen were more interested in their own fights with each other than in the Scottish campaign. Edward II himself was an uninspiring leader who commanded little respect from his commanders. When the battle started to go against them, this lack of sticking together and common goal meant that the English army quickly fell apart rather than fought with determination. The political results of Bannockburn in England were huge. The crushing defeat showed Edward II's weaknesses as a military leader and helped his political enemies inside the country. In the following years, Edward's power was slowly weakened by unhappy noblemen led by his royal cousin, Thomas of Lancaster. This trouble inside the country gave Bruce more freedom to make Scottish independence stronger. Strangely, Edward II's great victory at Bannockburn, or rather his great defeat, contributed to his eventual downfall and cruel murder in 1327. It's interesting to think about what might have happened if the battle had turned out differently. If Edward II had chosen better ground, if he had waited and forced Bruce to attack him when the conditions were better, if his archers had been able to position themselves well, history could have been very different. A Scottish defeat at Bannockburn would likely have meant the end of Bruce's fight. Scotland might have been taken over by England in the 1300s instead of staying independent for nearly 400 years until the Union of the Crowns in 1603. But thinking about what-ifs, however interesting, doesn't change what really happened. Robert the Bruce won at Bannockburn. Scotland gained its independence, and the world learned that even the most powerful army can be defeated by a weaker enemy that fights more intelligently. Bannockburn's influence can be seen in wars throughout history. In the American War of Independence, colonists often used similar plans against the British Army, avoiding normal big battles when possible, choosing to fight carefully when forced to fight, and using their local knowledge to their advantage. In the Vietnam War, Vietnamese forces used many booby traps, including spiked hidden pits, to cancel out American technological advantages. The main idea stays the same. Strength cannot always overcome intelligence and preparation. The Bannockburn pits also remind us that some of the most effective weapons in military history were surprisingly simple. They weren't new high-tech devices or revolutionary inventions. They were clever uses of basic methods. A sharpened stake in the right place can stop a warrior. A properly placed ditch can stop a tank. A simple drone can stop a sophisticated missile system. Military history is full of examples of high-tech weapons being defeated by creatively applied low-tech solutions. The Bannockburn battlefield today is a calm, peaceful place. It's hard to imagine looking across the peaceful green fields that this was once the site of one of the bloodiest days in medieval history. There's a visitor center and monuments, including an impressive statue of Robert the Bruce riding his warhorse, always watching over the land he fought so hard to free. Thousands of visitors come each year to walk the grounds and try to picture how the battle happened. Historians still argue about the exact details of Bannockburn. The shape of the land in the area has changed in the 700 years since the battle with wetlands drained and the path of the Bannockburn changed. First-hand accounts sometimes disagree about specific positions and movements, but the general idea is clear enough. A smaller Scottish army defeated a much larger English force through better leadership, better use of the land, and new fighting methods. Robert Bruce entered the battle understanding that this could be his last chance. If he lost, his independence movement would be crushed. He would be killed or forced to run away again. All the patient gains of 8 years of fighting would be lost. The chances were against him. Any sensible commander would have retreated and lived to fight another day. But sometimes in history there are moments when being careful must be forgotten, when everything must be risked on a single throw of the dice. Bruce made this move and won. He won not simply through luck or courage, though both played a part. He won because he did everything possible to ensure victory before the battle even began. He studied his enemy and understood their strengths and weaknesses. He chose where to fight with detailed care. He prepared the battlefield to control and disarm enemy forces. He trained his men until they could keep their groups together, even under the fiercest attack. And when the moment arrived, he led the battle with skill and decisiveness. There is a final lesson from Bannockburn that is more than just about war. It is about the importance of never giving up in the face of huge odds. Robert the Bruce lost battle after battle in the early years of his fight. He was forced to run away, to hide, to watch his brothers and friends be killed by the English. It would have been understandable if he had given up, accepted defeat, and asked for terms. Many men in his position would have done just that, but Bruce kept going. He kept going when it seemed impossible. He kept going when all logical signs told him to stop. And through this stubborn, never-say-die attitude, through never accepting defeat even when defeat seemed certain, he eventually created the chance for victory. The story of the spider in the cave, whether true or not, perfectly captures this spirit. Try, try, try again. In our modern world, it's easy to become focused on technological advantages, on having the best equipment, the most abundant resources, the most powerful force. Bannockburn reminds us that these things, while important, are not the only things that matter. Leadership matters, preparation matters, intelligence matters, terrain matters, morale matters. A smaller, poorer army, if well led and fighting with a purpose, can defeat a much larger force. This isn't just a rule for fighting. It applies to competitions in all parts of life. In business, small, new companies regularly do better than giant corporations. In sports, less talented teams sometimes defeat superior favorites through better tactics and greater determination. In politics, popular movements can overthrow seemingly unbeatable governments. The weak can defeat the strong if they fight smarter. The Bannockburn pits, that simple yet effective secret weapon, symbolize this principle. It didn't take a lot of money to create them. It didn't require advanced technology, just hard work, clever planning, and an understanding of how to use the enemy's weaknesses. Sometimes the most effective solutions to complex problems are surprisingly simple. You just need the imagination to see them and the determination to implement them. Today, more than 700 years after the battle, Bannockburn remains alive in Scottish culture and memory. It is remembered in poems, songs, and stories. Scottish children learn about it in school. It is mentioned in discussions about national identity and freedom. When Scotland voted for independence from the United Kingdom in 2014, 700 years after Bannockburn, both sides of the argument used the spirit of the battle to support their ideas. This long life and cultural memory is no accident. Bannockburn touches something deep in the human mind. It's a story of David versus Goliath, of the oppressed overcoming the oppressor, of intelligence winning over pure strength. These are stories we tell again and again across cultures because they connect with our desire to believe that justice and determination can win against the odds. But we must also be careful not to make Bannockburn sound too romantic. It was an extremely violent battle in which thousands of men died horribly. Many of the English soldiers who died were not cruel oppressors, but ordinary farmers fulfilling their duty to their lord, fighting because their lords had ordered them to. The Scottish victory, while freeing for Scotland, was a tragedy for countless English families who lost fathers, sons, and brothers. War, even when fought for right reasons, is always a tragedy. The costs of the Scottish War of Independence were terrible for both sides. Whole regions were destroyed. Cities were burned. Families were torn apart. The money systems of both countries suffered, and the feeling of hatred between England and Scotland lasted for generations. It is important to remember these realities when celebrating military victories. That said, it's hard to deny that Scotland had a right to fight for its independence. Edward the Firm and Edward II sought to conquer a free country and put down its people. They used extreme cruelty in their campaigns. They killed Scottish leaders with sick brutality. When a people faced such cruelty, fighting back is not only right, but necessary. And Robert the Bruce, for all his personal faults, and he had many, led that resistance with remarkable skill and determination. Bruce's brilliant planning at Bannockburn deserves to be recognized and studied. He turned his army's weaknesses into strengths, and the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. His weaker cavalry didn't matter because the land stopped the superior English cavalry. His smaller numbers didn't matter because the tight land prevented the English from using their number advantage. His lack of heavy armor didn't matter because he avoided the kind of close-up fighting where armor is most helpful. This is the main point of successful military strategy, creating conditions where your forces are helped the most and the enemies are hurt the most. Centuries before Sun Tzu was widely read in the West, Bruce was naturally applying the principles outlined in the art of war. He attacked where the enemy was weak, avoided where the enemy was strong, and used trickery and surprise to gain the upper hand. The pit traps were only a part of this. They were important, certainly, but they were effective because they were integrated into a larger plan. The pits channeled the English cavalry into areas where the Scottish schiltrons could more easily deal with them. The schiltrons maintained their groups because the men were well trained and led by experienced commanders. The commanders could lead effectively because Bruce had established a clear line of command and given each commander specific instructions. Each element worked together. It's tempting to look for a single secret weapon that won the battle, but the truth is that victory came from multiple factors working in harmony. Leadership, tactics, terrain, morale, preparation, training. They all played their part. The pits were important, but they wouldn't have been enough alone. Bruce needed everything working together to win. This complete approach holds true in most things humans do. There is rarely a single magic key to success. Instead, success comes from doing many things well and ensuring they work together effectively. A company needs a good product, but it also needs marketing, operations, finance, and people management. A sports team needs talent, but it also needs strategy, conditioning, teamwork, and leadership. Bannockburn shows this principle in the military context. As we wrap up our journey through this epic battle, it's worth reflecting on why stories like this continue to fascinate us so many centuries later. Part of it is certainly the drama. The storytelling parts of a Bannockburn story could come straight from Hollywood. There's the unlikely hero in Robert the Bruce, starting as a fugitive and becoming a victorious king. There's the villain in Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, and his unsuitable son. There's the climactic battle against impossible odds. There's even a dramatic one-on-one duel between Bruce and de Bohun. But beyond the drama, there is something deeper. Bannockburn represents a moment of possibility when the future was open and could have been different. It speaks to our sense of power, our belief that individuals and peoples can shape their own destiny rather than be passive victims of forces beyond their control. Bruce did not accept that the English conquest was certain. He fought to create a different future, and through skill and determination, he succeeded. In our own time, when we often feel powerless in the face of global forces, climate change, economic instability, political upheaval, stories like Bannockburn remind us that change is possible, that ordinary people can come together and achieve extraordinary things, that intelligence and preparation can overcome overwhelming odds. That persistence in the face of difficulty can eventually be rewarded. This doesn't mean we should be foolishly optimistic or ignore difficult realities, but it does mean we shouldn't give in to sadness or the belief that everything is fated. Robert the Bruce lost many battles before finally winning at Bannockburn. The path to success is rarely simple, but if we keep trying, if we keep adapting and learning, if we keep looking for angles and advantages others don't see, we can sometimes achieve what seemed impossible. Bannockburn's secret weapon wasn't actually the pits in the ground. It was Robert Bruce's mind, his refusal to give up, his willingness to try something different, his ability to see possibilities others didn't. The pits were merely the physical proof of this strategic creativity. Any commander with a shovel could have dug pits, but it took Bruce to see how to use them as part of a larger plan to stop the English cavalry. This is perhaps Bannockburn's most important lesson. Material resources are important, but mental resources, creativity, flexibility, strategic thinking are often more important. An army with better equipment but worse leadership will lose to an army with inferior equipment but superior leadership. A company with more capital but a worse strategy will lose to a company with less capital but a better strategy. In any competition, mental advantages often outweigh material advantages. As we move away from Bannockburn through the halls of time, as its bloody reality fades into historical distance, what remains is the history and the stories that shape how we think about ourselves and our world. For the Scots, Bannockburn is part of a national story of resistance and independence. For students of military history, it is a lesson in what happens when commanders ignore basic battle principles. For anyone facing overwhelming odds, it is an inspiring example of how determination and intelligence can win. The field at Stirling, where Robert the Bruce stopped Edward de Bohun, where the Scots advanced singing, where the English cavalry fell into hidden pits, where thousands died in a few hours. That field is now silent. The generations who fought there are long dead, their bravery and fear forgotten by most. But the story lives on, passed down through the centuries, retold and reinterpreted by each new generation. And as long as we tell this story, as long as we remember what happened on that June day in 1314, Robert the Bruce and his Scots will not have fought in vain. They gave us not just a military victory, but a story to inspire, an example to follow, and proof that even when all seems lost, as long as you keep fighting with intelligence and determination, victory is still possible. This was the true secret of Bannockburn. Not the pits, important as they were. It was the unstoppable spirit of a people who refused to accept defeat, led by a king who turned setbacks into opportunities and weaknesses into strengths. It was proof that in the words of the Declaration of Arbroath itself that would follow the battle, as long as even 100 remain, They will never submit. And that message rings true through the centuries, as powerful today as it was on that distant dawn when the Scots advanced to make history. It is important to remember that on that morning of June 24th, before advancing into battle, the Scots knelt in prayer. They asked for God's blessing before facing an enemy who outnumbered them and outgunned them. It was a show of deep faith, a recognition that regardless of their preparation and strategy, they placed their fate in the hands of God. Robert the Bruce and his men trusted not only in their spears and pits, but also in the help and justice of God. This combination of faith and action, of prayer and preparation, of trusting in God's will while doing everything within their human power, was perhaps the greatest secret of all. They fought not just for land or crown, but for a cause they believed to be right in the eyes of God. And that day, against all odds, victory was theirs.